Some of you are way too young to remember this. Back in 1969, some of you are not too young to remember. Back in 1969, a little place called Pass Christian, Mississippi. A group of people were preparing to have a hurricane party. There was a little storm coming up through the Gulf named Camille. Police Chief Jerry Petrala pulled up sometime after dark at this really nice apartment complex. The complex faced the beach. It was probably not 250 yards from the water's edge. Beautiful place. But they were directly in the line of danger. As he pulled up, a man with a drink in his hand came out on the second floor balcony and waved at the police chief. Chief yelled up at him and said, "Y'all need to clear out of here quick as you can. Storm's getting worse." But as other party participants joined the man on the balcony, they just laughed at Petrala's order to leave. "If you want us to leave, you'll have to arrest us." He didn't arrest anybody. He wasn't able to persuade them to leave. So he wrote down the names of their next of kin, of the 20 or so people who were gathered there to party through the storm that was coming. They all laughed as he took their names. They'd been warned, but they had no intent of leaving. At 10:15 p.m., the front wall of the storm came ashore. Scientists clocked Camille's wind speed at more than 205 miles per hour, the strongest on record, much stronger than Hurricane Katrina that left so much destruction on the Gulf Coast in 2005. Raindrops hit with the force of bullets. Waves off of the Gulf Coast crested between 22 and 28 feet high. News reports later showed that the worst damage came at the little settlement of motels and go-go bars and gambling houses known as Pass Christian, where some 20 people were killed at a hurricane party in some apartments. Nothing was left of that three-story structure but the foundation of the 24 people in the building. One survived. Storms come. Sometimes they come suddenly and violently. Sometimes they come and tear your world apart. Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee. It's been a hard day. He's tired. The crowds have been on him all day long. He said, "Let's cross to the other side." And as I say, he's tired, and so as they proceed out into the Sea of Galilee, he lays down, stern of the boat, and takes a nap. But the storm came up. And these are experienced fishermen. These are people experienced with being on the water, and they should be experienced with a storm. But this is not just a typical storm. It's beginning to swamp the boat. The waves are coming into the boat, and the boat's beginning to take on water, and they're beginning to get worried. And whether or not they were scared for themselves, we know they were because of what they said. But I think maybe they may have been a little bit concerned for Jesus. They woke him up. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" You know, that includes him. That doesn't include just him. That includes him also. I mean, he's asleep there. He could very easily drown. A big wave could come in and get him. So Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind. He said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." The wind dies down. Everything is completely calm. And then he turns to those disciples and he said, "Why are you so afraid? You still have no faith." Now they're more terrified, and they look at each other and they ask each other, it's like Storms come. Storms may not come in the form of a sudden furious squall. They may not come in the form of a hurricane. They may not come in the form of a tornado, but sometimes they come just in the form of a phone call from a doctor confirming a diagnosis. Sometimes it may be a police officer knocking on your door late at night with an automobile accident. Storms come in a lot of forms. Maybe a note from a spouse saying, I've had all I can take and I'm leaving. Maybe a pink slip from an employer saying, we no longer need you. We appreciate everything you've done, but you're not needed anymore. I remember my first time to receive one of those. It was devastating. I just don't need you anymore. Storms come, just as they came to those disciples on the Sea of Galilee. And the frustrating thing is that sometimes when the storms comes, it does seem as if God is asleep. Teacher, don't you care if we drown, said the terrified disciples. Sometimes when we're in a crisis, sometimes we're going through a crisis, it does seem like maybe God either doesn't hear or he doesn't care. Robert Browning wrote a famous poem. The lark is on the wing, the snail's on the thorn. God is in his heaven, and all's right with the world. He wrote those words in the mid-19th century, which was an era of boundless optimism. Since he wrote those words, there have been 2 world wars. There's been the Holocaust. There's been numerous genocides. There's been the terrible specter of international terrorism. Few people today would dare to say that all's right with the world. I wouldn't. Worse yet, as Arthur Philip Yancey notes, God seems to stay in his heaven despite all that's wrong with the world. And we wonder, why doesn't God do something? A Romanian man filed a lawsuit against God for allegedly fouling up his life. The suit stated that the man was promised a good life in return for various goods and prayers, and that the 20-year sentence he was currently serving in a Romanian jail represented a clear breach of contract. Kind of silly, isn't it? Kind of stupid. It's absurd. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like that? God, you letting me down. Be honest. Sometimes we cry out like those disciples of old, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? In the text for today, Christ does stir from his slumber. He rebukes the wind. He says to the waves, be quiet, and then the wind dies down. It becomes completely calm, and he turns to those disciples and asks, why are you so afraid? You still have no faith? And I believe that's the main part of this lesson. We know that storms come. We believe that Christ has the power to calm the storms, so why are we afraid to trust God's promises? Christ knew that his disciples were human beings, that he knew they were given to fear. He knew that they were still growing in their faith. And it sounds a little hard to me, his response to their question, don't you care if we drown? That sounds a little hard. But if we read it deeper and we think on it and dwell on it a little bit, we realize it's the hardness of a coach who wants his players to get the routine down so precisely so that when they're tested, they will be able to respond as they were coached. Because he knows what's coming. He knows what's ahead for these disciples. But he also knows what's coming for us. He knows what's ahead for us. He wants to help us with our fear. I think a greater tragedy than the storms that come into our lives would be to make the wrong response to those storms. Let me give you just a a couple of brief suggestions on how to cope with life in the midst of the storms that come our way. First of all, we need to prepare for them. They're coming. They will be here eventually at some point in our life. There will be storms. So we need to prepare. Makes sense then. If we know storms are coming, don't think we ought to get ready for it. People on the Gulf Coast now, when they hear storms are coming, they don't stay there anymore. They don't have hurricane parties anymore. They get out. They prepare. If you know a tornado's headed your way, you don't have a party. You prepare as best you can for it. We save. We put money in the bank to save for it. When a storm is coming, we save. We prepare for it. A TV news camera was on assignment in South Florida filming the widespread destruction after Hurricane Andrew. In one scene, amid the devastation and the debris, stood one house still standing on its foundation. The owner's out cleaning up the yard. The news reporter went over to him and said, "Sir, if you don't mind having an interview with me, tell me why all the other houses are destroyed, but your house is still standing." The man said, "Well, I built that house." And he said, "I built it according to the hurricane code for the state of Florida. Whatever that code said needed to be there, I put it in it, or maybe a little more." And he said that code said if it was built according to this code, it would withstand a hurricane. And sure enough, it did. I guess all the other houses around didn't follow the code. He was prepared. But suppose that storm had been cancer, the loss of a child, or some other tremendous tragedy. How could he have prepared? A lot of ways we can prepare for a storm. We can make sure our relationships are strong. Our relationship with our family, with our friends, our relationship with church, with God. It helps when you're going through a storm to have others there with you. You never want to go through it by yourself. And even if you don't have a family, you can build relationships here in the church so that you have people who will serve as a support group. Ask somebody who's gone through the storm of an illness or the loss of a loved one whether close relationships really make a difference. You find they do. He could have prepared himself for the storm mentally and spiritually. We mentally and spiritually prepare ourselves by building our lives on the rock. You remember the passage of the man who built his house on the sand and the storms came and that house fell, but the other man built his house on the rock and the storms came and the house stood. There comes a time in our life when we decide what we believe and how we will live. I will live according to God's building code. I will live a life of quality, trusting God's promises. There are other ways to live that might bring us more sensual gratification, less sacrifice. We believe that our lives have a purpose and a meaning, and that a loving Creator has intended our lives for something more than just animal satisfaction. And so we seek to live our lives according to God's code, so that when the storms come, and they will come, when they come, we respond with faith, not with fear. Just like a well-trained athlete responds in the contests in the way that he or she has been coached. That's not to say that we've stopped being human. We may still go through all the steps associated with grief and loss. We go through denial and anger and rejection and guilt and bargaining and depression and confusion and acceptance. But we go through the process without it overwhelming us. And then eventually when the storm has run its course, and all storms do, they don't last. When all the storm has run its course, we see how God has guided us through it. There have been times, I'm sure, in some of our lives, some of your lives, some others' lives, we know people who have been through things. There's some folks at Trinity Church that I don't see how they've made it, but they've made it. They've made it through faith. They've made it through the grace of God. And they give God the glory for it. If we're wise, we reflect on the lessons that we've learned from this experience, for this purpose of storms is to produce growth. Robert Schuller told a story once in a sermon about a farmer in Washington State who was especially proud of the apples that he produced every year. And he was proud with good reason, because his farm was high up in elevation, and the cold winds that came through his farm made his apples especially crisp and flavorful. And every year after he harvested his crop, he would polish those apples until they virtually shone, and then he would put them into beautiful packages to show them off. These were not your run-of-the-mill, average run-of-the-mill apples that you find out at Walmart on the roadside produce stand. These were the kind of apples that made beautiful gifts to send to loved ones for Thanksgiving and Christmas. His word of his marvelous apple spread, it got to the point where he was just overcome almost with orders, even before he would harvest the fruit each year. Things were going great for him. He was enjoying raising these beautiful apples and sending them out all over the country to people. Then one year, just before harvest time, a severe hailstorm hit his property. When it was all over, there was not a single apple that didn't have some kind of a blemish on it. There was nothing wrong with the apples. They just didn't look as pretty as they usually did. This farmer was afraid that the people who ordered the apples ahead of time would get these apples and see the blemishes on them, and they would be disappointed with them, and they would ask for their money back. And then he had an idea. He took all the apples with the little blemishes on the outside, and he wrapped every one of them in the very same way that he did every year. He put them in the same kind of packages, and then he added a note. And the note read, "Notice these high-quality apples. This year represents the finest crop. You can see the blemishes caused by the hailstorm, which created the extreme cold, giving the ultimate flavor and ultimate crispness to these apples." Not a single order was returned. In fact, just the opposite happened. The following year, when his orders started coming in, he had many requests from people who wanted to make sure that they got the apples with the blemishes this year also. Now, that's the way it works for people of faith. We don't escape the blemishes. We wear those blemishes proudly. Well, we couldn't be who we are today without the growth that those blemishes brought with them. Storms come. If we're smart, we'll prepare ourselves for that time when life sends us that unexpected storm. We'll prepare ourselves by building strong relationships. We'll prepare ourselves by keeping our relationships with others and with Christ strong, mentally, and physically, and spiritually. And we'll build in the life, the rock of faith, which is Jesus Christ. Not looking to the world, but looking to God. Storms come. How we deal with it is all up to us. Father, thank you. Thank you for this time. Thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings of the day. Thank you for these that come this way. May they grow and learn in this time together. May they celebrate with each other. In Jesus' name.